All right, and we're back for a special episode of Time Egg LP Discusses this week, where we're, rather than the traditional format of asking questions, we're going to take one series and specifically focus on it. And I've come up with five questions to kind of guide the conversation.
About that one series in general.
Yep. And the series this time is, I mean, if you're going to start with anything in this genre, it's going to be Final Fantasy.
Yeah, it probably is.
Because unless you're in Japan, Final Fantasy is the Jerpoga series. I mean,
Yeah,
you'll be hard pressed, I think, to find anybody who disagrees with that sentiment,
yeah, it's the big series.
which is
It's the one
funny
everyone knows.
because in Japan it tends to be more focused on Dragon Quest, but for some reason Dragon Quest just doesn't really tickle people in the rest of the world the way it does Japan.
No, it doesn't.
Maybe it's because medieval Europe is just more interesting to Asian people.
I could see that. It's definitely a lot more straightforward, traditional as far as the narrative and in later games, the combat and everything else goes.
Yeah, I don't know. Anyway, but even from the start, it was Final Fantasy. So I figure for the first question, uh, to give some context to the discussion going forward, let's talk about the games in this series that we finished. Because
God,
I think like if we were to talk about let's say we do one on Dragon Quest, this would be a very short list.
yeah,
So, but for Final Fantasy, I think we have a little bit more grounds for
mhm,
this conversation to take place.
yeah.
So, go ahead, lay it on me. Games you finished.
All right. I finished four. I
Okay,
finished the weird little sequel to four.
let's just focus on mainline entries.
Well, it's I'm still calling it one, but yeah, whatever your point. Um, I haven't finished seven, but I feel like I played enough to have an understanding of it. Um, I got to the final fucking boss of 10, but never actually beat it. I did all three 13s, 14, which is the MMO, and 15.
Did you beat 15?
Yeah, I beat 15.
Oh wow! And you still didn't take my copy, even though I was like, "Here, play this." And if you give a shit, you can keep it. And you gave it back,
Yeah, I did not like it the first time.
and I sold it for 26 bucks
Damn.
and never looked back. So games I've beaten in this franchise, I've beaten one. I played about half of two. I've beaten three on the PSP. I just recently beat four for the first time all the way through. I've gotten to the final boss before, but never finished it. I played about a third of five. I finished six. I finished seven. I finished eight. I played about 75% of nine. I finished 10. I finished 12. I got to the final boss of 13. And that's about it. I played about 5 hours of 15 and hated it. So I've actually played a lot of games in this series.
You played a lot of the earlier turn-based ones.
I mean,
I
realistically, considering the later ones are MMO, you have an MMO for 11 and 14, so those are
you have an
difficult to count.
it's like you have an MMO for 11 and 14.
So
You have
you,
that weird real-time action, whatever the hell it was, for 12.
which I did play,
13
I
has this
finished
weird
it.
real time. Yeah, I know, but I'm just saying for the
I,
ones after 10 in general.
yeah, it's when they stopped being turn-based, and even then, I
Yeah,
finished most of them. 15 is the only one I haven't really. I mean, think about it. It goes 10, which I finished,
yeah.
12, which I finished, 13, which I got to the final boss on, and then 15.
uh,
So, I mean, in terms of the older turn-based ones, that's most of the franchise. Although, when you consider the development cycle, it definitely doesn't seem that way.
Yeah.
But that's kind of a question that we can get into later, I think.
All right.
So those are the games that we've finished or have at least played enough of to feel like bringing up. So to try and keep this on a more positive note, because I know I have a tendency to go pessimistic, I tried to keep these questions
More
fair,
positive.
yeah, fairly positive. So let's focus on the games that you like or your favorites in this series.
Okay.
And the next question is, what does the series do well? But let's, when you talk about your favorite game, maybe think about it with that context of like, what does this game do well that maybe other games from other series don't do as well?
Okay.
Or
Hmm.
just focus on what's your favorite, just for starters. And we'll get to that later. I may have jumped the gun there.
So what's your favorite?
Or just which ones do you like?
Um, I really like 13. I know no one else does, but I really like 13. I know it doesn't really count, but I actually really like 14. As far as the turn-based ones, I haven't played a whole lot of them, but I'm gonna go with the older, like, sprite-based ones. I really liked 4. I suspect I'll like 6. Those would probably be 13, 14 for the newer ones, and then 4, and I'm expecting 6 for the older ones.
I feel like I should say part of the reason I don't want to count 14, because a lot of people will point out that it has a story mode, and there are actually people who play it for the story mode,
Played the story.
is
I
is
liked some
is
of it.
that it's still in progress. I think it's hard to say you like something that's unfinished.
Yeah, but if you I mean, I get your point, but
I think at
uh,
some
as
point it
as
would
an
be,
MMO, as an in progress game, it'll be ongoing for a long time, but I'm up to date as of the most recent major patch.
but I'm just saying in terms of discussing it as a product that's in progress compared to the other games which are completed, I don't think it's a fair comparison. I think it's too much its own thing. It's kind of like discussing a TV show that's in progress to a bunch of movies.
Agree.
What?
I disagree.
No?
Because you can mention that TV show and talk about that TV show to the full extent of all the seasons that are out, and if it has, the most recent season has an ending, you can talk about it in the scope of what exists. It has a beginning, it has a middle, it has an end, it has that whole arc. Just because there may or may not be another season later doesn't mean you can't talk about it.
But there will be a season later. And the problem is it doesn't have that ending because even the current expansion is still being added on to.
Yeah.
So it's still in progress on every metric. So anyway, so you're saying the older ones for your favorites and the ones you like?
So my favorite is 13.
Okay.
For just ultimate, favorite 13, and you continue to like to not hate it or not like it, but 14 are my two favorites.
It's not that I don't like it. I just don't think that it,
It counts.
yeah, in this particular context.
Well, you said mainline Final Fantasies, so I understand your hesitation, but those are my two. And then as far as the older ones, I like 4.
And what about these games? I mean, it's obviously not just what is it, but why.
For 13, I like the world. I like the fact that it's not a standard, straightforward fantasy world, which I know a lot of Final Fantasies do anyways. I like the world design. I like the two split worlds that they have and the world building that they do in it is something that I really like for 13. For 14, I can't really tell you why because I don't even know why myself. And for 4, I just had fun with it.
And no real just expanding on
No,
that. You just had fun with it.
I had fun with it. That's a good enough reason for me to enjoy something. I played it. I had fun playing it. I don't know
It's
what
enough for
about it
you
that
to enjoy it, but it doesn't add a whole lot to the conversation.
I know. I know it doesn't, and I'm. But what about it stood out for me?
Yeah.
I I don't know.
So,
Ah,
having
eh,
played 4 recently,
okay.
uh, I can say, at least from my end, one of the things that I liked about it, net
Yeah.
some I'm kind of neutral on it, but one of the things that I really enjoyed it for was its simplicity.
Okay.
I don't know how long it took you, but it took me only 14 hours and 50 minutes. I think was the New Game Plus save file time.
Yeah, I'd
And,
believe something like that.
and that was doing all the side content that you can do,
Yeah.
up until the post game.
Okay.
So getting all the summons and all that crap.
Okay.
And it, what I liked about it, particularly because the PSP version has an auto battle, which is pretty much the only reason that I was able to tolerate it, was it reminded me of the Chrono Trigger esque age where a JRPG could be less than 20 hours and
Okay.
still tell, still
A
be
complete
complete.
story.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, granted, I think 4's storytelling is incredibly goofy.
It is goofy.
Characters are introduced and killed in the same fucking scene, and it's expected to carry some kind of emotional impact.
Yeah.
Like it's a riot to me that there are people that, and I mean, I don't understand how some people like tout the story as something genuinely of quality
Why not?
when there's just like so little build up or emotional resonance because things just happen. It's like you walk in to a castle and then Edward is there for the first time you ever meet him. Or I think you approach the castle and then the castle gets bombed.
Yeah.
And then you walk in and then there's Edward and there's Anna dying and you're supposed to like feel something for these characters
Yes.
that you've never fucking met.
Yes. You just walk in and you see someone dying and you see their loved one grieving over them and experiencing their death as it's happening. That's sad. Just because you don't know the person doesn't mean you can't empathize with them.
But it
So you
does.
so you come in, you immediately are entered into this, sad, I'm sure there's a better word, grief-filled experience. And you empathize with this character that you don't know, and then you get to know them.
But
That's
most
still
of their characterization is, I mean, you never really know Anna.
no, you don't know Anna, but that's
You never get anything filled in on her.
no, but that's not the
Edward is
characters that we
barely a character because he's only with your group.
all the way through the most of the rest of the game and all of the
No, he's not because
spin-off sequel.
he gets bumped off the ship. That's when he leaves your party, pretty early on. Apparently, you don't remember this game very well.
I remember some of it. I'm not.
He joins your party. You go to the antlion, then you take that back to Rosa. Go through the cave, and I don't remember afterwards. But at some point, you get on a boat, and the boat gets attacked,
Okay.
and then that's when Cecil wakes up alone, and you go to Meridia and become a
Yeah.
paladin.
Okay.
Edward never I think he rejoins the party after that, maybe like for one dungeon
Yeah.
or something. I don't remember. But that's the thing. Like people are coming and going and dying and undying. That I and it all happens in like one scene, and it in a way it's nice because it's that old school simplicity where nowadays, like I've said, I feel like everything is over explained.
Yeah.
Like things are just spelled out for you like 5 times until you just I fucking get it.
Hmm.
But this is like underselling it. It just doesn't have enough build up for me to really connect to any of the characters, nor do any of the characters unto themselves have enough depth to really feel engaging.
All right. Yeah. I understand your point. I think you want something more serious than it wanted to be.
Oh, it wanted to be serious. It took itself very seriously.
You think?
Oh yeah. For a game where you go to the moon, yeah, it took itself very
That's
seriously.
that strikes you as it taking itself seriously?
Okay, that's one of the things about Final Fantasy. Okay, fuck it. I wanted to be positive, but if we're going into this, fuck it. We're going into this. Final Fantasy is a game series that simultaneously takes itself way too seriously and has no fucking remember the game where Aerith gets stabbed through a sword and everybody's like it's one of the saddest moments in gaming.
Yeah.
It's the same one where one of your party members is a fucking remote controlled cat riding an oversized stuffed doll.
Yes.
Like the tonal variation is absurd in some cases.
Yeah.
And that can be one of the problems is that sometimes the goofier moments overshadow the more serious ones. Like I was making a joke with a friend about the final boss who's an interdimensional space wizard
Okay.
until I realized that out of all the games, like half of them, the final boss is an interdimensional space wizard
All right.
because that's just how Final Fantasy raises the stakes.
Yeah.
It's like it space wizard. I don't fucking know. Even from the first game, time travel right out the gate. Right out the gate,
Okay.
we just into what the fuck are you on about, land?
Yeah, but just because it has time travel doesn't necessarily make it bad. I mean, Chrono Trigger, that's the entire point of the game.
But Chrono Trigger also had an excellent balance in its tone, where it never took itself so seriously that its comedic moments became almost parody by extension.
It never got serious when you went to the future and everyone was starving to death.
But even that, it had moments where it was reminded you that it was a lighthearted game, like the in Vegatron, "You're still hungry" line
Yeah.
was great, and that was Chrono Trigger. Even in its most serious moments, it let them be serious, but also could have fun with it. I mean, you had a Johnny, the racing robot, which was great.
Okay.
It knew how to be balanced serious and goofy, and that's where Final Fantasy is just taking itself too seriously, while at the same time having just absurd shit happening.
So Chrono Trigger is good because it's both serious and funny, but Final Fantasy is bad because it's both serious and funny.
Well, because one balances the tones better than the other.
How is it balanced? If one is, it sounds like Chrono Trigger is kind of funny but not super, and kind of serious but not super, so it balances out in the middle. Whereas Final Fantasy is very funny or very silly and very serious, so again it balances out in the middle.
No, the problem is that it's serious about 80% of the time, and then goofy 20% of the time, and then pants on head retarded about 100% of the time. It, it's the fact that when Final Fantasy takes itself seriously, it's usually there's a chance that it's going to be stupid.
There's always a chance that it's going to be stupid. That's existing. There's always a chance that anything can be stupid.
Yeah, and when something takes itself seriously and is stupid, that tends to create a disconnect.
Okay.
And that's what I'm saying. When you have a scene where a character is dying and it's supposed to be a tragic scene, and I don't even know who the fuck these people are, or a character's entire motivations have been summed up in about 3 dialogue text boxes because that's the limitations of what they had in the early SNES days. It doesn't work. And when half your villains are space wizards because you don't know how else to raise the stakes, it just becomes goofy and dumb.
Okay. So your first point was that you can't feel a connection with these characters because you don't know them very well.
Because it doesn't take the time to set them up.
So if something sad and awful and atrocious is happening, but you don't know who they are, then you don't care.
In
That sounds just
fiction,
like
yeah.
that sounds like just a lack of empathy. Like these characters are there and they're going through something, and you just don't give a fuck because you don't know them yet. The scene itself is
But
part
you
of
never
what's
get to know
drawing
them. They never do
Okay.
anything. That's what I went on to say, is that all their characterization is pretty much summed up in
You
that they're
already
all
hated them,
one-dimensional characters.
but but you already didn't care and hated them from the start before you even knew that you weren't
I
getting
didn't
anything.
hate them. I just didn't care.
You just I'm just hearing you walk in, you see all this stuff, and just say, I don't give a fuck.
Well, because you have to make someone care. They don't just inherently care. It's like the science fiction problem. I destroyed your home planet. Like that's so many lives lost that it ceases to have any kind of, well, I guess that's a different argument, but it's similar in the context of it's just cheap drama. Just because somebody is dying doesn't make me inherently care. People die every day. The only reason, I mean, when you're going through that castle, there's so many more bodies, but the game is focused, just fuck them. I mean, they don't matter. The game is singles out these characters because they matter to the story that it's trying to tell,
Okay.
but then doesn't flesh those characters out enough in a way that that I can have any kind of emotional connection to them.
I'll agree with you that Anna didn't really get a whole lot of character. She got a little bit, but not a lot. But she's also dead. But Edward got as much as any of the supporting characters.
And that's pretty much next to nothing. I mean, let's look at Cecil's whole dark sword thing, right?
Okay.
The game starts out, and he did the thing in Mysidia and supposedly murdered a bunch of people to get the
Yeah.
crystal,
Okay.
and then he flies back to Baron feeling guilty about it, which we know because he says basically, "I feel guilty about it,"
Okay.
and then he gets the, he doubts the king, and then the king, in what seems like just a snap psychotic judgment, demotes him
Yeah. Because that's exactly what it is.
in like 2 text boxes.
Because that's exactly what it is.
It, and it's a riot how quickly that scene progresses.
Yeah, but
and then
earlier.
and then he takes the crystal to um, Mist Village, where it blows up
Hmm,
and everyone dies,
Okay.
and then we never mention Mist Village again, like
Isn't
maybe
like
once.
isn't Rydia's story based around Myth Village and what happened?
No, she apparently, Rydia's entire story is, and then Cecil goes, she's like, no, I don't like you, and then you go into the first village 3 minutes later, beat up a bunch of soldiers, and then suddenly she's like, okay, fine.
All right.
She supposedly has an aversion to fire because of what happened to her village, but you never find this out until the second before she gets over it. So good job not setting that up at all. Other than that she doesn't learn fire, which I never even noticed until somebody brought it up.
Okay.
So great. And that's pretty much it for Rydia. I mean, she then falls off the boat and then comes back as an adult, but nothing really happens. There's no arc there.
Okay.
There's no reflecting on her village. And then once Cecil becomes a paladin, that's it. I mean, he never again brings up the stuff that he did as a Dark Knight. The game tries
But
to pretend at the end of the game that the fact that he somehow cleansed himself of the darkness means that he can use the crystals, but it's never really implied that he had darkness in his heart anyway, because from the very first time we saw him doing terrible things, he had remorse for it.
okay, but that's clearly not the first time that he's done terrible things.
When else has he done terrible things, though?
Before the game,
Yeah, but like
like
what?
before he was the captain of the ship for God knows how long and did whatever the hell he did.
You don't know that. But that's like you don't know that because it never mentions any previous missions. It says the king only recently went crazy and started looking for the crystals, so you don't know how fucking long this has been going on.
All right.
You don't know how long he's been training in the dark sword. He mentions that the king makes all their people train in the dark swords, but it doesn't mention, like, was this a recent thing? They say the king used to be a good guy. How long ago was that?
Mm.
I don't fucking know. I
But
don't know anything because Cecil has no fucking backstory. He has no character. He's a Dark Knight who regrets his actions and then becomes a paladin, and then that's it. He just stops having any character.
I don't know. I'm just noticing how 20 minutes ago you said that you enjoyed the fact that it was short and simple, and now your complaint is that it was too short and it didn't say enough.
My complaint isn't that it's too short, it's that it's poorly characterized. There's a difference.
But if they included all that stuff, then it wouldn't be the short, simple game that it is. It would be all the things that you were saying you were glad that it's not. This
No,
long, drawn out, over explained.
it could still be short. It just wouldn't necessarily be 14 hours. It could be 17 hours. Big fucking deal. It doesn't take a lot. It just takes a few well chosen lines here and there, a few more scenes, just a little bit more in each place. And also stop killing off characters only to have them come back because holy shit, that's cheap.
Alright, you say so.
I do say so.
Anyways, positive point, because that's
Okay.
going nowhere slowly.
Because what do you want? It's my opinion, and you're just saying no without bringing anything to the discussion.
Positive point.
I like how you're bailing on this. So, for my games that I like in the series, um, I like 10 in particular, kind of. There's a caveat to that, because the last time I played 10, I really enjoyed, and I have this habit with the Final Fantasy games where I tend to enjoy the first third, kind of enjoy the middle third, and then the last third, the gameplay gets so fucking tedious that I start falling off the fun train
Okay.
because the series random encounters suck, and
Yeah.
the random encounter rate tends to ramp up towards the end, and you also tend to get some really cheap ideas of difficulty. And
Okay.
this is coming from somebody who plays Shin Megami Tensei mainline, and I look at some of this shit and I'm like, yeah, that's cheap. I don't game over as much, but it's still a nuisance. But in terms of what I think 10 does well that I haven't seen from a lot of other games. First of all, the island setting is great. Um, it, it's still fantasy, but it's fantasy with a spin that you don't typically see. It's not medieval Europe fantasy, and I
Okay.
appreciate that so much.
Okay.
I like I like that it doesn't use the ATB system. I know a lot of people love the ATB system. I don't get it. I spend a lot of time with the ATB system, either waiting around or trying to navigate a menu as quickly as possible.
Okay.
It's so the movement away from that to the combat that it does have, I appreciate. I think that the characters have solid ideas. It's a
Okay.
really colorful cast of characters in a way that I think some of the other games might not capture as well.
All right.
And I also like that it's one of the few games, it's rare, kind of rare, that you see in a game where the objective at the start of the game is the objective for almost the whole game.
Yeah, I'll actually agree with that one. There's no major surprise twists or anything like that.
Yeah, Final Fantasy X, your goal is to get to Xanarkand. The game doesn't quite end, but pretty much more or less ends when you get to Xanarkand.
Okay.
And I like that. I appreciate that. And in terms of things that I think it does better than other games in the franchise, one of the things that I don't like about 7, which, take it or leave it, is that the character roles aren't defined at all. Any
Yeah.
character can be anything because it's more about how you build your materia.
Yeah.
I'm not a huge fan of that personally. I like characters to have roles, and I
Yeah.
like it when those roles
Are
matter.
clear.
Well,
Okay.
also matter. Like in 10, there's an enemy that has a shell, you need either Orin to take care of it or somebody with a piercing sword. If it's a flyer, Waka or Magic. If it's nimble, Tidus has to slash it. Like there's things that require certain characters,
Okay. Yeah.
and I really like that, especially compared to other games in the series.
I did too. It's actually one thing that's been my gripe with 7 as I've been playing it. And so yeah, with 10, with the clear roles and the clear reason for each role.
And I also really don't dislike 13.
Yeah.
I think 13 is, I think it's a tragedy that it's one of those games where its reputation precedes it.
Yeah.
That's not to say that its reputation is not entirely undeserved, just that there's such a strong preconceived notion about what the game is.
That for a lot of people that's all it is.
Yeah, that they never get past, like, okay, so yes, all the maps are a hallway,
Yeah.
and that's not the greatest thing in the world. I'll like, okay, I can see that point,
Yeah.
but I don't necessarily think that being that that unto itself is enough to make the game bad, because I don't really like, I like wandering around a world map. I think it's fun. I think it gives the game a sense of openness,
It does.
but not having it doesn't kill the game, as long as there are other things to make up for it. And what you do get out of that trade off is pacing, story pacing in particular,
Yeah.
is spot on in 13.
Yeah.
Stuff is
And I
always happening because you're always moving forward.
so that was my thought with 13 and with the hallways. It is very linear, but it keeps things going, whereas with the exploring and everything, it has to halt. So
And
it feels linear because they wanted to tell the story they wanted to tell without interruptions and side quests and things.
Well, it's linear because they were trying something new. It
Yeah.
was it came out at the time when people were moving towards the more open world idea
Mhm.
and ideology, and rather than release another Jerpega that that followed the more traditional vein that people were moving away from, they wanted something that was very accessible to as many people. So they
Okay.
essentially streamlined it, like
Alright.
literally into a fucking line.
Yeah.
And while I don't agree with that choice, I appreciate that they were at least trying something new rather than just trying to release the same
Do the
thing over and
same.
over.
Yeah.
I take issue with it when they went on and made 13.2 and 13.3. That's where I think the series should have just stopped after 13, but they tried something new. It may not have been a hit, but again, the pacing was spot on. I also like the combat. A lot
I
of
do too.
people talk about it being, like, oh, you just push auto battle.
Yeah.
But I fucking came from FF4 where I just auto battled almost everything. And I mean literally fucking auto battled. Like, it chose all the moves. I didn't even have to pick the fucking classes.
Yeah.
Because let's be fucking honest here, Final Fantasy does not have the most intricate battle system.
No,
In
it doesn't.
terms of the tactics involved in battles, most battles can be easily solved by just pressing the attack button.
Okay.
So to pretend like the battles are bad just because
Because
you
just the attack button is all you need.
because you're just scrolling, you're not really scrolling through menus selecting abilities. I disagree with, because you do still have to balance your classes and your
Yeah.
roles. And that comes back to what I was saying, what I enjoyed about 10, where every character has a role. Every character has something they're good at. So you have to think about your party composition. So, yeah, you use auto battle a lot because you're busy thinking about other things. I'm more engaged in most fights in Final Fantasy 13 on average, you know,
Yeah.
than I am in any other Final Fantasy game, because most other Final Fantasy games you just set up
Everything
basically
before battle, and then during battle, it's all just attack, attack, attack.
or
Whereas, then,
cast Knights of the Round and then spam that shit. Once you set up
well, yeah,
your rhythm,
yeah,
there's no
then
reason to
you're set.
deviate from it. Yeah.
Whereas 13 is a bit different because 13, all the setup, all the classes, everything is real time during the battle. So you
And
focus on that, and then you can still just use attack, attack, attack in the background while your real focus is on class management.
watching the stagger bar and managing your buffs and all those other things that are imperative to, winning the battle.
Yeah,
So I really do think 13 is a good game for what it is.
yeah,
And I'm not going to say there's some games where if it wasn't in Final Fantasy game, it'd be, people love it. I don't think
yeah.
that,
No,
but
but I think if people weren't expecting another Final Fantasy like the old ones and knew it might be something weird and different, they might have received it better. It still would never be perfect, but I think it would have been better received.
yeah, I mean, literally, its reputation precedes it.
Mm,
People have shat on it so much that don't even, most people I don't think have even played it that shit on it.
yeah.
I think it's just one of those things that carries that stigma.
Mm-hmm. And
So,
honestly, I feel like 13.3 is the same way because it is so different than 13's 1 and 2. But
but anyway, so yeah, the other thing with 13 is it's funny enough, kind of the only time, well, It's not really turn-based, but it kind of is. It's closer to turn-based. I don't know.
No,
It,
it straight up uses the ATB system.
which in the older games I definitely consider turn-based,
Yeah,
and
so I would not call it turn-based. It's like charge-based, maybe,
it's
but
difficult. And
there are no clear turns.
eh. Anyway,
Uh,
the
what?
it took them that long to not have random encounters. It's the first time in the series that there was the first and only time in the series that there's a separate battle screen, but no random encounters.
Yeah,
And it took them way the fuck too long to figure that out. That's why 10 and 13 are probably my favorites because one, I like the simplicity, but it's got that old school problem of no concept of balance, and you take one step and you get into a battle with 8 enemies,
yeah,
and it's just time consuming, man, to fight 8 fucking enemies. And then you get out of battle and take another step, and there's 8 more enemies
yeah.
and one random encounter, and just shit like that. Just that old school design philosophy that you really have to be a diehard fan of.
Yeah, once you play games without random encounters, you get used to it, and going back and playing the random encounters, things like that, it's hard to accept.
Well, it's less the random encounters and more the fact that the encounters themselves range from can be done in a second to time consuming. When I say 8, that's not hyperbole or exaggeration.
I know it's not, but
I mean, like, one of the first fights in the game you can run into is like 3 goblins and 2 hobgoblins. And it's like, why are there 5 enemies in a random encounter right at the start of the fucking game?
uh,
Shit takes too long. But that's how those older games were. They were padded to hell and back. I'd rather
yeah.
have 2 enemies with the stats of 5 enemies than 5 fucking separate enemies. Because then you gotta wait for turns and all that. 4 was the first time they really had a story worth telling.
Yeah.
2 was Star Wars,
Yeah.
which is ironic because 12 was also Star Wars.
Was it really?
Oh yeah, you have a desert rascal who teams up with a rogue pirate to fight the evil empire and rescues the princess aboard a starship.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
That game was Star Wars to a fucking T. Um, five, five, five is a very goofy, lighthearted game. It just does not have enough. It's a
Okay.
game. Okay, this is the thing where there's a gap between what I like and what I appreciate.
Okay.
I appreciate five more than I do four because five is just a lighthearted game. It is the embodiment of just the Final Fantasy lighthearted goofiness.
Okay.
I can never get into five because there's just not enough fucking plot happening.
Okay.
I appreciate it, but I just cannot personally get into it.
Okay. I can understand that.
But yeah, and otherwise, the PS1 era games, random encounters, again, just kind of bleh
Yeah.
for me
Big
these
part.
days anymore.
That's fair. All right.
So let's talk about a bit. I mean, the biggest thing with Final Fantasy is its popularity has always been an enigma to me.
Okay.
But this kind of ties into the question: what does the series do well? What does Final Fantasy do that no other series does as well?
Recently, recently, I would say experiment. Ever since 10 onward, they haven't been afraid to change things drastically in the attempt of finding something new. So every one, even if it's not great, it never feels stale or samey because they're always trying something new and unique.
I think you could extend that even back further
Maybe so.
because I it had classes before Dragon Quest had classes.
Hmm.
It had, I mean, the ATB system, while I don't care for it personally, is different.
Yeah.
It, 6 was when they started combining and incorporating the mecha stuff
Yeah.
or the science fiction elements into the story.
Hmm.
So, I mean, it's definitely a series that is willing to take risks.
Yeah. That's one thing I can appreciate that it does over other RPG series.
Okay.
Um,
So, for one, for me, um, I appreciate that the series tend to not get too anime with their stories,
okay.
which is funny because literally spiky hair, big sword came from Seven.
Yeah.
But I mean, you look at something like Tales and Persona, and then you look at something like Final Fantasy, and while they definitely have some similarities, Final
One is very much more anime than the other.
yeah, and it's not that I mean, Persona is one of my favorite fucking games. I obviously like anime, but I
Mhm.
enjoy playing 10 now, which I'm doing right now. I see the way Tidus as a character could be anime character,
Okay.
and I'm enjoying that he's not.
Okay.
He's still a goofy idiot, but he's
Yeah.
not your traditional derpy anime isekai main character.
Makes sense.
And I think that's something that Final Fantasy has done well in the past. I don't know as much nowadays. It's hard to tell because Goofy Boy Band was a bit weird.
It was.
I don't know about anime, but it was weird.
Yeah, I wouldn't go anime with that one, but I couldn't. I could see where people would make the argument for it.
It's more like the pretty boy
Mm.
Bishonen shit
Yeah.
than it is anime. That's Nomura in a nutshell.
I get your point for JRPGs, especially being not with anime style, is kind of rare, actually.
It is. It's very rare,
'Cause that is the go-to.
and that's what I'll that's what I'll give them for doing. Well. It it's not anime, but it still incorporates that melodrama
Hmm.
that we like. I mean, let's be fucking. Let's not
Yeah,
kid
that's
ourselves. We like the melodrama.
yeah.
It's not that I don't like people dying on screen. It's just that I have to know who the fuck they are and give a shit about them when they're dying. Do you understand? Anyway, uh, another thing the series does well, although I think is taken. This one's hard for me. Let's talk about the music for a second because Nobuo Uematsu is infamous at
Yeah.
this point, or maybe just famous. I don't know. For being some of the best music in video games.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's that I dislike his music as much, or if it's that I just dislike the fact that it feels like it dominates too much of the conversation.
Okay.
Because I have to admit that there are some Final Fantasy tracks that are absolutely stellar.
Yes.
To Xanarkand is fucking it's great. It's a beautiful track,
Okay.
and a lot of the tracks have that sort of hummable quality to them. I mean, it's like the old Mario question. I would never think that Mario has good music, and yet you can instantly tell Mario music.
Yeah, there's that one song that everyone knows.
So, the Chocobo theme, the level up theme, or the victory theme, the main theme, all these infamous Final Fantasy themes that I
Hmm.
recognize, but I wouldn't list them as like my favorite tracks. And that
No.
that's that's where I don't know if it's my taste in music or the fact that there are so many great composers out there. I mean, now that Persona 5 is huge, everyone fucking knows about Shoji Meguro. So, good on that front. But there's other people out there too. Like, I really like a lot of the SMT 4 tracks. I really
Okay.
like a lot of, again, now that Automata is huge, everybody fucking knows that guy. The point being that when it comes to this genre and this medium, I think there's a lot more out there than
Than there used to
just
be.
than just Uematsu.
Yeah.
And I think that because the series is so popular and it does have good music, that he tends to dominate the conversation in ways that necessarily don't allow as much room for other just as talented artists to come in.
I get your point. I would have agreed before, but like you said, those other ones are starting to get known now.
They're starting to.
They're starting to. And I feel like with everything else getting well known, that's going to be less so now.
Well, it's also less
But
known now because Uematsu doesn't do
yeah.
anything. He hasn't worked on a Final Fantasy game since 10. 10 was his last one. He's
Mhm.
done a few tracks for 14, I think.
Yeah. But 5 years ago, that would have been the only name everyone knows and totally agree. Now I think it's shifting a bit.
And like I said, there are great tracks. Can You Hear the Cry of the Planet? I really like from 7. The Geneva theme, I love from 7. Terra's theme from 6, excellent.
All right.
But on the whole, I'm just not as in love with it as everyone else.
That's fair.
But it is definitely something that the series does well.
It's worth noting
Mhm.
because it does do it well. I don't know. One of the things that I like about the series, at least post four or maybe five, is the kind of unique setting they go to where they have this mix of and fantasy and almost not quite realism, elements of modern day, but elements of that still old school fantasy, and they mix them in a way that's not very often seen.
Yeah,
I like uniqueness in that mix of settings to make something its own.
it's kind of a mixed bag though, because I mean, you can't say that like Final Fantasy VII doesn't still have, at least for half, probably more than half, the game is very traditional fantasy.
It is, but they
And
also they mix these modern, helicopters and cars and an Earth city with fantasy and the swords and magic, and that's what I'm talking. The magic tech setting might be the thing in particular.
maybe
It's a
I
mix. It's a mixture of both that I don't think I really see a whole lot.
Yeah, I have mixed feelings on it. I mean, it's different, kind of, but
I'm not gonna say it's the only one that does it because it's not,
that's the thing is like I've seen this
but it's
happening.
not common. It's like the only ones that I can think of are it and maybe the trails
Trails
that have
does it.
that Magitech setting.
I don't know. I can't think of names off the top of my head, but I know I've seen a lot of Tales games do that.
And a lot of the tails, yeah. Well, yeah, some of the tails. I'm gonna say some, not a lot, but a few.
I anyway.
But I like that unique setting, and I think Final Fantasy does it well.
Yeah, I think some games do it better than others. Like that's another thing that I do like about 10 is generally you don't have guys with swords fighting against soldiers with guns.
Yeah,
I generally like that. It does happen later on with the Albed, but and the mechs and shit, but at least at the start of the game, no swords and guns.
yeah. See, that's I don't know. I like that for some weird reason.
Okay. It, it just there's like a limit for me where it just starts. It's never like a deal breaker,
Yeah.
but it just starts making me raise my eyebrow a bit. It's like the typewriter and refrigerator and Chrono Trigger. Like you apparently have electricity in this world,
Hmm.
and yet for some reason it still looks like the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
That's weird.
And I like that though. I mean, it's not serious. It falls apart if you try and think about it and you try and find the logic in it. But I think if you can just sit back and enjoy it for what it is, you can get a lot of enjoyment out of it.
I mean, I don't need like a Brandon Sanderson esque fucking bibliography on shipping manifests in this fantasy world. It just still weirds me out when it's a fucking fantasy setting and blitzball is being treated like football and there's fucking video cameras like showcasing broadcasting this on TV.
Yeah.
And it's like if you have this technology that can send signals, video signal over distances,
Hmm.
how are you not using this to like communicate with like
Thing.
where is Sin? You know, have like a Sin tracker, have a
Yeah.
dude with a phone, beep beep beep, Sin's on this island, get the fuck out.
Yeah.
Like the sole reason that technology exists in that scene is so that we can have blitzball be
Be
football.
a sport. Yeah.
And that's to me where it's kind of like, did we need this?
It's a consistency.
The only reason it exists is so that it can better parallel our world.
Hmm.
And that's where it breaks down for me. I think, like, because again, the only thing I have issue with is the broadcasting part of it.
Yeah.
The giant dome, blitzball itself, whatever, I have no problems with that. It's just the fact that it's being broadcast over television.
Yeah.
And
I'll agree with
that to me is an example of where it goes a step too far, but is it going to make me quit the game? Is it like anything I'd mention if I was typing up a review? No, but it's something I noticed.
Okay.
It just kind of is. I mean, the problem is when you give carte blanche to anything if you just, don't think about it and go with the ride. Because I appreciate that sentiment, but then you start getting into some really, really stupid shit like Kingdom Hearts,
Yeah.
and I can't do it. I can't deal with Mickey Mouse talking about the fucking Heartless.
Yeah.
Nope.
Well, if that's not your thing.
I tap out, and I don't think you can enjoy. I don't know. That's a topic for another time. That's getting way off topic.
Alright.
So, what do you want to see in the next main entry for Final Fantasy? Final Fantasy 16. Not much has been said about it. There's been
What is
some
it?
rumors that the director of Final Fantasy 14 is going to be in charge. Those rumors seem to have been defunct, but who knows? What would you like to see from Final Fantasy 16?
That's a good question. I hadn't thought about that. I don't know.
So should I go ahead and go first then? Give you some
I
time?
want it to be good.
Oh yeah,
I mean,
no shit, Sherlock. I want it to be a
eh,
steaming pile of ass.
some people are gonna say that because they want the series to be over with. I want it to be good. Anyways, yeah, go for yours, and I'll.
I'd like to see the series stop chasing trends because
Okay.
I feel like that's, for better or worse, what it's been doing for a while. Like with 13, I appreciate why they did what they did, and I appreciate that they were trying to innovate. But I would have preferred that rather than trying to innovate for the sake of an audience, they just innovated in a way that they thought would have better benefited the game.
Okay.
And with 14, 1.0 was a disaster. So
Yes.
for 2.0, they basically played it safe and copied World of Warcraft, and it
That's fair.
was a great success. So that this is why I say it's better or worse. But once again, they basically just went with something else.
Yeah.
And for 15, they're essentially, I mean, there's
Yeah.
two ways of looking at it. They're going for the open world trend because that's the thing,
Hmm.
or they're um, chasing to rectify the problems of 13 by going to the opposite extreme.
Going. Yeah. All right.
Either way, I don't care for the open world thing.
Yeah. I did definitely prefer the second, much more linear half of that game.
And then 7R, I mean, you're literally remaking Final Fantasy fucking 7. What do you want me to say? Like, I would like for whoever makes 16 to make it what they want it to be and not have it be based on whatever the trend is, whatever you're trying to address from the last one.
Okay.
Make what you want to make.
I could see. I don't know. Honestly, I would like to see a modern attempt at a more old school style game. Go back to maybe the turn-based, the ATB. Use everything they've learned in the newer games to make it feel unique and fresh, but capture some of what made the series great to start with. Now, what exactly that is, I couldn't really tell you. But those things that made, you know, six, seven are the two that I know are most well received. Get some of those old themes and ideas and take that into a modern game with modern technology and do what they would have done then if they could do then what they can do now.
I mean, I think people would say that that's what the 7 remake is.
I disagree because the 7 remake is basically 7 but in 15. It has the combat is very reminiscent of 15. It feels like playing. It feels like playing a better version of 15 is honestly what it feels like. A somewhat more streamlined. less open worldy version of 15. That's what the 7 remake felt like. I'm talking old school turn based, feels like a game almost out of the 90s, but with the quality of life changes that have been added in the 30 years since then, with the things that we come to enjoy, but using the best of what was still good.
Okay, and this leads me into my last question, which was where do you see the series in 10 years? Because to me, I mean, the reason these are two separate questions is there's what you want to see and then the reality of it. And the
Hmm.
reality is, I don't think you'll ever see a return to turn based for Final Fantasy.
I don't either.
I
I, to answer your question, I think 10 years from now it would have been recognizable. I think between 10 and 15, it's mostly unrecognizable, and 10 years later it'll have shifted to something completely different again.
It's hard to say because to me, 15 is really the ultimate example of just the embodiment of chasing a trend. I mean, it's open world real time combat.
Mhm.
Like, how much more can you chase the trend from here? How much more can
Yeah.
you just do whatever the fuck you can to appeal to the masses?
Mm. Okay.
Like, I mean, it's hard. You're right in a way. If you put 10, 12, 13, and 15 next to each other,
Yeah.
aside from the visual tie-ins from your consistency of having Nomura as the character designer, it's really difficult, I think, to see them as a series in the same way as if you look at 1 through 9. I mean, even
Yeah.
10 you can throw in there.
Yeah.
And that, I mean, is it due in part to the longer production times? Because I think part of the problem these days is that a mainline Final Fantasy game takes. I mean, where do you see the series in 10 years? In 10 years, fuck, I think we'll have Final Fantasy 16, and that's it.
Might not be wrong. Yeah.
It takes them so long to make anything new that this is where I think the experimentation can almost backfire
Yeah.
because you don't have the time to make those refinements that you get. Like, uh, if, on a macro level, you can look at the evolution of the ATB system
Yeah.
from the original Super Nintendo 4, where you couldn't even see the bar filling up, it was invisible,
Okay.
to and 5, now you can see the bar. Now you only have 4 party members because managing 5, when you're timed on everything, might not be the greatest thing ever. They were able to make incremental changes
Yeah.
throughout the series because they kept the same thing. And even on a micro level, you can look at the jump from 13 to 13.2, and even though I don't, in terms of the changes made to the core combat mechanics,
The change is refinement, not drastic shift.
just even stuff like not having to watch an animation the first time you switch your roles,
That was annoying as hell.
yeah, and just getting rid of that,
Yeah. Like I said, it's refinement.
yeah.
It's when it came out. We saw what was good, what we saw was bad, and fixed. And I think, yeah, 1 through 6, maybe even all the way up to 1 to 9. I haven't played them as well. Seem to be that of taking something and just making it better, improving on it, and making slight shifts, but the core of it is just improving.
And even then, 10 is really just a return to turn based without the ATB system. It's not.
Yeah.
it's not like it's some kind of radical combat shift. It's not the press turn system or anything.
No, it's not a, but it's the shift away from ATB that they've been doing for the past 9. You're right, it is, aside from the ATB, it does still work the same way. So it's not as radical a shift as any of the other ones,
But
but
then
it's still, yeah.
you get into 12, and that's where it really just starts really to stop looking like what you would expect a Final Fantasy to look like in terms of 1 through 10, and that's what makes talking about the future of this franchise so difficult. I think is it really I feel like ever since 12 it really doesn't know itself what it is or what it wants to be.
I could see that. It wants to be the thing that is succeeding. So it takes the Final Fantasy themes and the Final Fantasy, icons and put them in a version of whatever is in. So whatever the future Final Fantasies look like, basically just they have crystals and chocobos in whatever game is popular 10
Yeah,
years from now.
and I mean, uh, you say that Final Fantasy VII plays like a refined version of 15, but 15 itself was based on Kingdom Hearts,
Yeah,
and it's like, is that just going to be the future? Is it just going to be a continued merging of the two as Nomura just takes more and more control of this company? Because people really like 7R,
I to be honest, I really enjoyed it.
and I I think 15 has been one of the least discussed games in the franchise ever, but it didn't garner the negative reaction that um, 13
Did
did.
no, 'cause 13. My theory about that is that 13 is very what it was. It's linearness. It was very linear. It was very that. And if you didn't like it, all you were getting was that thing that you didn't like. Whereas 15 was bland and forgettable. So if you didn't like it, it was just another thing that was kind of meh instead of probably being just a lot of bad. I think that's why 13 got more hate because it was more bad and less bland.
Yeah, yeah, I can agree
It-
with that.
It's like because having played all through 15, bland is the easiest word to describe it.
Well, I mean
Safe, generic, bland.
that's like my problem with it. Like to me, it can be summed up in its visuals. They're technically very pretty, but to me, it's like designing a robot to perfectly replicate a photo.
Hmm.
Just take a fucking photo. What I like to see in art, in drawn art, is an artistic style, not a recreation of real
Of
life.
something that, yeah,
That's
the
why,
it's like the skill in making it is really there, but not the creative passion in it,
yeah, it doesn't have the creative design of something like, again, Persona 5.
or just the older Final Fantasies.
Yeah, even that. And it's like that's a really fucking, like a lot of man hours went into designing this game. Holy shit. But
No, and it
it's,
looks great, and you look at it and you can see, holy shit, this looks amazing. A lot of effort was put into this, just not a lot of passion was put into it.
and then you just forget because none of the areas are unto themselves interesting.
Yeah,
So, and that, I don't, there for a while, it was questionable. The future of Final Fantasy was definitely shaky in the 13 and 14 1.0 era.
yeah,
And then 14 relaunched with 2.0. And I think saved the series in a way that most people won't give it credit for. And
Yeah,
I don't mean that in a way that they won't give it credit in terms of they refuse to give it credit. I just,
won't recognize
yeah,
what it did.
don't think people will appreciate how much 14 has kept Final Fantasy relevant.
It kept the name relevant enough.
That 15 can come out and be mediocre, and it doesn't tank the
Yeah.
franchise until 7R came out and finally became something that people lost their shit over.
Then people got finally legitimately excited about a Final Fantasy for the first time in
In the
who knows
gap
how long.
since 2008, whenever the
Yeah,
fuck 6 or 13 came out.
yeah,
So in in that context, I get why Square Enix would be inclined to continue giving Nomura the freedom with the franchise to do whatever the fuck he wants.
yeah,
But he definitely has a direction and vision for the franchise that I don't think necessarily lines up with a lot of the more traditional elements.
yeah.
And there will be a certain portion of that older fan base that won't follow along.
That won't follow Final Fantasy itself nearly as much, and they'll try to find replacements for it.
And
Now, because of that, do you think Final Fantasy will pick up a new following of people who follow the trends? Do you think
I think it has.
it's like I was just saying, do you think a lot of people pick up 15 just because they like open world games?
I don't think so much with 15, but I really think 14, again, being an MMO,
It's like,
has
oh,
drawn a
definitely
lot of new blood to the franchise that's more willing to accept the new because they don't have the
that.
preconceptions of the old.
Okay.
And who knows? I mean, Nomura is busy right now with the 7 remake. So 16 could be handled by any director.
Yeah.
So it won't necessarily be Nomura. I just suspect, given the amount of influence he's had in that company, that part of the company, his fingers will be in that fucking pie.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what bums me out the most.
I just hope
And
it's good.
and where I kind of see that the future of the franchise is just very much Nomura.
Yeah.
And it's gonna become more like Kingdom Hearts because that's what sells.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, this was a happy, optimistic way to end this.
It was good for a little period there.
It,
It
it,
started off really dark, and then it actually got kind of good and cheerful, and then it just shat on itself right at the end there.
well, it's hard with Final Fantasy to talk about.
The future and be optimistic because
I'm uh, the reason I like doing these, honestly, these discussions,
no,
is because at least we just won't suck the cock of Final Fantasy and every other fucking basic bitch shit. I mean, I'll suck Persona's cock all day, and now that's basic bitch thanks to 5. But this is what I don't get: is if Final Fantasy is so fucking loved,
why isn't it so fucking good?
yeah, like
Because it was at one time, and
like
everyone's holding on hope that it will be again. Which, like I said, is exactly what I want 16 to be.
and I don't know. It feels like Final Fantasy can be mediocre
And get away with it
and get away with
because
it
it's fun.
because production value,
Yeah,
and
and
it's
and that's because it can. It's like 15 proved that. 15 proved that it can be average, generic, nothing stand out, but it's an amazing game to look at, and it's a Final Fantasy game, So, yay.
And this is where I have a problem with that attitude of just, if you just sit back and enjoy it and don't think about it, then it can be a good time. And it's like, yeah, but that's true of almost fucking everything.
You think?
I think it's true of a lot of things. If you just stop thinking about things, then suddenly everything becomes better. No shit, Sherlock. But then do you really appreciate the good things when you have them?
Yeah.
Or do you just fucking play shit and then forget about it a year down the road because you're just, everything's the same?
No, you still can. As someone who does shut off when it gets bad and just enjoys it for what it is, you can still catch things that are good.
But do you appreciate them on the same level?
I feel like we've been over this before too. Probably
It's,
not.
and it's just that's how I feel. I mean, God, this episode is going so fucking far off the rails. But to use an example, I think I talked about this in one of our other episodes where
Okay.
somebody mentioned if you die on a boss, then the only thing you can do is go back and grind.
Yeah.
And that should not be the fucking case. I don't think that should ever be the case unless you're like running away from all the fucking battles. Like obviously there's a limit, but
Yeah.
the fact that grinding and JRPGs are so synonymous that I see people talk about it in games where you don't have to fucking grind.
Yeah.
When people talk about Persona 5 and they're like, "Oh, it uses the grind." It's like, "You fucking grind? You don't need to fucking grind."
Yeah. Some people do,
Like,
and it makes it easier.
it's easy enough. It's fucking super easy.
Is
It's even
it?
not hard.
Is it?
Yes.
Is
But
it?
that's the
Is that you
difference.
or is that the game?
Well, that's the difference. It's both. That's what happens when you have a combat system where you can do more than just attack.
Yeah.
When it's more than just push the X button, when you can't just set up your rhythm and then rinse, repeat, and win every fight. Ostensibly. Unfortunately,
Yeah.
Persona gets that way because it's too easy towards the end. It doesn't balance its difficulty curve well. But at its best, that's what it's pushing you to do. And that's where I feel like a lot, just the mindset of, rather than having an interesting combat system that engages your brain, we'd rather just run back and forth for an hour, hitting the X button over and over and over and over and over until we can go back to the boss fight and hit the X button over and over and over and
'Cause I don't
win,
want a strategy game. Fuck strategy games.
is more appealing to people than just having to stop and think for 5 seconds.
Yeah, because didn't want to play a strategy game. Which at times I understand.
I understand it at times, and I don't want it to necessarily be a grid-based strategy game where everything takes 10 years. Just do something interesting. Grinding is the least interesting thing you can do. It's not fun.
Grinding is the least interesting thing you can do. It is
And
awful.
it saddens me that it's so strongly associated with this genre when in fact there are games out there that challenge that idea. Games like your Shin Megami Tensei's, games like your Trails games where you fucking EXP return drops off a cliff if you try to grind. Because at the end of the day, they just want you to be a certain level, and then how
They
you
just
equip your characters and what you do in battle and what characters you use are more important than your
then just your
level.
level. Yeah.
But that's where how much is this the fault of Final Fantasy for being that big thing that everyone else has copied? Or, if you want to be more accurate, Dragon Quest, since that's what really laid the groundwork for this.
Yeah.
And that mediocrity of grinding, of just having a big open world game but with nothing in it, or just blandness.
It reinforces the idea of levels, of the leveling system of what originally made an RPG what it was. Because that was some kind of leveling and stats and everything. That was what defined an RPG. And grinding was how you improved that one defining feature. So I understand why it's the thing associated with it now.
Well,
I
what I'm
I think I think we're ready for something more, but I understand how it got there and how grinding is the RPG thing. Because stats and levels are the defining characteristics of an RPG.
and this is where I don't want to say that Final Fantasy, that there are some games where it's explicitly a problem. I don't want to say it has no strategy. It just doesn't have a whole lot. And it seems like when it has games that do, people tend to push back.
Yeah.
And I don't think that it's a series. It, I don't want to call it a mediocre series, but is it mediocre because of these things that are actually problems? Because everything has problems.
Yeah.
Or is it mediocre because it's the standard? It's what everything else is judged by. It is that baseline.
Yeah.
And I mean, to close this off, finally, on hopefully a more neutral note, the Final Fantasy is that baseline. Whether you like it or hate it or just kind of feel middling on it, almost every game today, in some way, at some point in its life cycle, looked at Final Fantasy for inspiration. Not all of them, but a lot of them.
But a fair lot.
Final
Yeah.
Fantasy and Dragon Quest, the two franchises. There's the reason they're the big daddies,
Yeah.
and there is no escaping them for the most part. You have to try real fucking hard.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's our discussion on Final Fantasy. It was definitely not quite as optimistic as I was hoping for, but fuck it, nobody listens to these anyway.